All right, let's continue then on Slovo Park. Violence broke out earlier today between protesting residents and police. As we've just heard, police have been trying to reopen the N12 highway, which was blockaded by the protesters. Residents are understood to be protesting over service delivery issues at the informal settlement. At the same time, the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa has condemned the force police used against the Slovo Park protesters. Let's now bring into this conversation Thato Masiangoako, a researcher at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. Researcher, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. I mean, looking at this incident and many others, including Marikana and the Nathaniel Julie's case, would you say police are better equipped to facilitate protests? I mean, not too long ago, we saw how the French police were, hailed for, trying to combat violence, and not a single incident was reported there in terms of police force. What are we missing here in South Africa in terms of that?
Thank you so much for the question, and greetings to your viewers at home. It is unfortunate that the SAPs continue to respond to protest in the way that they have by using excessive force and not abiding by their own regulations in terms of how force should be used. Standing Order 262, the Regulations of Gatherings Act, and other policies and regulations that govern the way that SAPs are supposed to respond to protests stipulate that they're supposed to exercise caution at all times, that they should always display, the highest degree of tolerance. And so there does seem to be a perception of protest on the part of the police, where they just view protest as either a terrible inconvenience or at worst case scenario, criminal. And if the police were instead to recognize protest, one, as a constitutionally protected right, but also as a cause that community members are seeking to draw attention to, then they would rather see themselves as facilitators of that protest. They would enter a situation with caution, try as best as possible to see that the protest can happen to the degree that it is possible, and then they also contain the protest in a way that they don't end up harming bystanders, for example. So you'll recall in 2021 in March, Mthokozisi Mtumba was shot and killed by the police. But again, Nathaniel Julie's, which is a case that you mentioned, was shot and killed by the police in August of 2020. So these are all people that, even if they're not involved in protest, unfortunately, the way in which the police exercise force in their indiscriminate manner just renders everyone at risk, not just protesters, but also members of the public.
As we heard also from, the community leader at Slovo Park, now there is another fight that they are going to be fighting, and that is to see justice for the 16-year-old boy who was killed. And they also want, some of the community members to be released. The SAPS is but one stakeholder. Let's look at government's intervention here. I mean, just 7 years ago, this community was celebrating a high court order that was granting government to implement its upgrading of the informal settlement program. At that point, the community leader then thought that things would change, but 7 years on, they haven't. Why is government so slow to act? And as a result, we are now sitting with the situation where the N12 is blocked, where a child has died.
Yeah, it is. Look, it's terribly unfortunate. And as you would have heard from Mr. Mwala Hidan, they have been sitting in a task team meeting on a regular basis, or as regular as possible, with the city of Johannesburg, with officials from province and various other supporting stakeholders. So SIRI sits alongside the SPCDF on that task team as their legal representatives, but mainly in our capacity as research and advocacy. But they also have support from CUBES and One-to-One. These are organizations. CUBES is housed by the University of the Witwatersrand, and CUBES is an organization that works with informal settlements and various other similar communities. So this body has been sitting over the past 7 years, I would say, trying to support the city in its implementation of the UISP in fulfillment of its obligations as ordered by the High Court. But our experience of those have been really a lack of clarity, and at this point, access to services in the community have continued to deteriorate. So over the past 2 to 3 months, the situation of water has become terribly dire, where the community has very little access to water. And the sanitation situation is something that the community has raised repeatedly. So these are basic services that the city of Johannesburg is obligated to provide. But even in terms of the court judgment, the Milani 2016 court judgment, you'd assume that Slovo Park would at least be well on its way to permanence, well on its way to development. But unfortunately, the community have found that they have no other option but to take to the streets, because the UISP is a policy that all metros and municipalities across the country should actually be implementing, and the Department of Housing has demonstrated a shift towards this. But there does seem to be a lot of issues in terms of how municipalities are implementing the UISP. There also seems to be a lack of communication or clarity in terms of the different spheres of government. So from municipality to province to national, there's a lack of clarity in terms of how they're supposed to coordinate in upgrading settlements that are identified for that program.
Thato, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really do appreciate it. Thato Masiangoako, a researcher at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. And of course, what she is saying is very important so that we understand what is behind these latest protests in as far as Slovo Park is concerned. There was a court case that was won by the community in 2016, in fact, where government was then compelled to implement its upgrading of informal settlements program. That has not been done.